There is a silence that only a few can hear. It is not the absence of noise, but the absence of illusions. A kind of stillness that arrives uninvited when the veil is lifted, when the mind begins to see things not just as they appear, but as they truly are. It begins subtly, like a shadow that trails you when the sun is low. At first, you don't even notice it. A question here, a moment of discomfort there, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes, a gathering that feels strangely hollow. Life carries on, but something in you stirs, a restlessness, a disquiet, a quiet knowing that there is something offbeat in the rhythm everyone else seems to dance to. You begin to observe more carefully. The way people talk, what they pursue, what they fear. The world starts to seem like a stage, brilliantly lit, energetically performed, but strangely lacking in meaning. You notice how often people speak, without saying anything. How much energy is spent proving something that no one actually cares about. How relationships sometimes feel more like negotiations than connections. How ambition is often just another word for escape. The more you see, the more isolated you become, not because others push you away, but because your mind begins to walk a path they cannot follow. And here is the paradoxy. Knowledge opens your eyes, but it also breaks your heart. There is a price to seeing too much, a sorrow that comes not from the world, but from perceiving it too clearly. You begin to understand how transient everything is, how time consumes even the most cherished moments, how beauty fades, how joy, no matter how intense, eventually dissolves into longing again. You see the threads, how desire leads to suffering, how clinging leads to fear, how even love, in its deepest form, is tinged with the ache of impermanence. And yet you cannot unsee it. There's a kind of mourning that accompanies every new layer of understanding. Not a dramatic grief, but a quiet one. The kind that lives in your chest, nestled somewhere between awareness and acceptance. A mourning for innocence, for simplicity, for the days when ignorance allowed for easier joy, when a smile didn't come with an analysis, when connection didn't come with conditions, when mornings felt full, not because they were, but because you didn't know what they lacked. Schopenhauer believed that the intelligent are more prone to suffering precisely because they are more aware. Where others see the surface, they see the depths. Where others laugh and move on, they stop and ask why. Their minds are not content with distraction. They crave meaning, and meaning is never cheap. It asks for your comfort, your certainty, and sometimes even your peace. But this path, though solitary, is not bitter. There is a beauty in seeing the world with clear eyes. It is a heavy beauty, yes, but it is real. It is the kind of beauty that doesn't depend on hope or fantasy. It is not the glow of rose-tinted glasses, but the quiet light that remains after the fire has burned out. A soft glow that touches everything, the joy, the pain, the loss, the longing, and says, this too is part of it. You begin to find comfort in the questions, rather than the answers. You stop needing everything to make sense. You start noticing the details. The silence between words, the wariness in a stranger's smile, the way a tree leans just slightly toward the light. You learn to love not because it lasts, but because it exists at all. You learn to feel deeply, not because it's safe, but because it's true. And slowly, your solitude begins to shift. It is no longer loneliness. It becomes a sanctuary, a space where your thoughts can breathe, where your soul doesn't need to shrink to fit in, where you no longer pretend to be less sensitive, less curious, less intense. You accept that you are not meant for noise but for depth, not for crowds but for quiet, not for everything but for something true. Still, the ache remains. It always will, because to see the world as it is to live with a certain tenderness, a vulnerability that never quite hardens. You carry the weight of knowing how fragile people are, how fleeting moments are, how easily things fall apart. But in that very fragility, you find a different kind of strength. Not the strength of denial, but the strength of compassion, the strength of presence, the strength of standing in the storm without needing to run from it. The world will often tell you to dull your edges, to simplify, to conform, to stop thinking so much. But deep down, you were not made to close your eyes. You were made to see. And though that seeing may sometimes isolate you, it will also awaken you. It will show you what others miss. It will break you, yes, but only to rebuild you into someone who can walk through life with open eyes and still somehow choose love. Because in the end, that is the only redemption, to love the world, even when it cannot love you back in the way you understand it. To choose presence over performance, meaning over distraction, depth over ease. So if you find yourself alone with your thoughts, if the noise of the world feels too loud, if the simple answers no longer satisfy, know that this too is part of the journey. You are not lost. You are simply seeing more than most are ready to, and that is not a flaw. It is a kind of grace. Let us now walk deeper into the lesson, into what Schopenhauer truly meant when he said that intelligence leads to suffering, and why this suffering may just be the doorway to a more honest life. There is a moment, quiet and imperceptible, when clarity first takes hold. It does not arrive like a storm, it whispers. It unfurls slowly, like the edge of dawn creeping over a sleeping landscape. At first, it's just a feeling, a slight dissonance, a hesitation in laughter, a pause in joy, and then it deepens. It stretches out across everything you once took for granted, leaving no corner untouched. Clarity is not the shining sword of epiphany. It is the slow erosion of illusion. And this, as Schopenhauer so tragically understood, is both a gift and a burden. To live with clarity is to live with the weight of knowing. It is to see through the thin veil that most wrap around life like a protective cloth. This veil, stitched from small comforts and borrowed beliefs, shields us from the deeper questions. Why we suffer, why we desire, why we age, why we die. For many, this cloth is enough. They live suspended in a dance of distractions, moving from one goal to the next, one gratification to another. They call this happiness. And maybe, in some way, it is. But the mind that dares to look beyond cannot go back. It begins to unravel the stories we tell ourselves. That love will save us, that success will complete us, that time is abundant. The intelligent person, in pursuit of truth, cannot help but confront the temporary nature of all things. They see that pleasure fades as quickly as it arrives. That joy is always trailed by the shadow of loss. That forever, is just a poetic way of saying, for now. Schopenhauer saw this with brutal clarity. To him, the human experience was not a grand ascent, but a tragic loop of desire and suffering. We want, we strive, we grasp, and the moment we attain what we longed for, we begin to want again. This endless cycle, the will, as he called it, is not our salvation, but our prison. Intelligence makes this prison visible. It reveals the bars not made of steel, but of illusion. And once you've seen the bars, you can't pretend they're not there. The curse of clarity lies in the inability to forget. To re-enter the dream once you've awakened is near impossible. Where others laugh easily, the clear-eyed hesitate. Where others chase fleeting pleasures, the awakened hesitate to run. It's not cynicism. It's not bitterness. It's a kind of mourning for the simplicity that once was, and for the naivety that once made joy easier to access. The intelligent, in their awareness, begin to feel time more acutely. They see it slipping, not in years, but in moments, in a gaze that doesn't linger, in words that are left unsaid, in a hand that used to reach for yours but no longer does. They start to notice how much of life is performance, how people often speak not to share, but to be heard, how love is sometimes mistaken for possession, and how even kindness can be a form of currency. This clarity does not necessarily make someone cold. It can, in fact, make them unbearably tender. Because they see the fragility in everything, the impermanence, the delicate balance that holds it all together. And with that tenderness comes pain, a deep, aching kind of empathy, a sadness that isn't loud, but constant. The pain of watching people run toward things that will never fill them. The sorrow of knowing that what is most real often goes unnoticed. And so the intelligent begin to withdraw, not in arrogance, but in exhaustion. Not because they believe they are better, but because they feel too much. They grow wary of conversations that stay at the surface, of relationships built on pretense, of ambitions that feel hollow beneath their glossy finish. They crave depth, and when it cannot be found, they choose silence, not as a punishment but as a refuge. This solitude, often mistaken for aloofness, becomes a sanctuary. It is where the intelligent retreat to make sense of a world that rarely pauses to ask, why? It is in this silence that they begin to rebuild themselves, not from belief, but from understanding. They no longer seek approval, but truth, not because it comforts, but because it liberates. Because in a world saturated with noise, clarity, though painful, is the only path to authenticity. And yet clarity is not a final destination. It is a beginning, a doorway that opens to a path few dare to walk, a path that demands the abandonment of easy answers, a path that teaches you to live without certainty, to love without possession, to seek without expectation. It is a path that often feels lonely, but never empty, because it is filled with the rawness of what is real, grief, yes, but also wonder, doubt, but also awe. Schopenhauer knew this path well. He lived most of his life in solitude, misunderstood by his peers, often dismissed for his bleak outlook. But beneath the surface of his despair was a deeper reverence for the truth, for the sublime, for the few moments in life that break through the veil and touch something eternal. Music, for him, was one such moment, a rare expression of the will that transcended suffering, a brief escape from the burden of knowing, a reminder that not everything we feel can be named, and not everything we know must be carried alone. So perhaps the curse of clarity is not a curse at all, but a call to live more deliberately, to love more consciously, to speak more truthfully. It is not an easy life, but it is a real one. And in that reality, there is a kind of peace, not the peace of oblivion, but the peace of presence. And once you arrive at that peace, something changes. You stop needing the world to understand you. You stop chasing answers that will never satisfy. You learn to sit with your questions, to befriend your doubts, to stand in your own truth, even when it isolates you. Because in that stillness, in that solitude, you realize something profound: that clarity, though it may separate you from the crowd, brings you closer to yourself. And that is where the next chapter begins. In the reflection, in the quiet turning inward, in the deep realization that wisdom was never meant to make life easier, but to make it more meaningful. And so the intelligent retreat, into books, into thought, into silence, not with bitterness, but with a quiet resignation, an understanding that to walk with open eyes is to walk apart. They do not choose solitude as much as they are chosen by it, as if the very act of seeing more makes the noise of the world unbearable. Not because the world is evil or ignorant, but because it moves too quickly, too loudly, too blindly, for a mind that craves stillness, depth, and truth. This solitude is not always lonely. At times it is a sanctuary, a shelter where the soul, exhausted from its constant exposure to pretense and performance, can breathe freely. It is here that thoughts are allowed to grow roots, that emotions can be held without being explained, that being is enough without the need to be impressive. But even sanctuaries have shadows. Even peace has its price. There is a silence that accompanies the intelligent, one that others rarely understand. It is not the silence of shyness, nor the silence of disdain, but a kind of reverent pause, a slowing down, a refusal to fill the air with words that mean little. When you see the emptiness behind most conversations, the hollowness in casual pursuits, it becomes difficult to participate. You begin to sense the distance between words and meaning, between appearance and substance, and in that distance you find yourself alone. This kind of solitude is not visible. You can be surrounded by people, you can be loved, even admired, and still feel alone. Because solitude, in this case, is not the absence of company, it is the absence of resonance. You speak, and the words echo back differently. You share, and the depth is missed. You offer your inner world, only to realize that most are speaking from the surface. The loneliness is not physical, it is existential. And yet, you do not blame them. How could you? Not everyone is meant to see the world the way you do. Not everyone is burdened by beauty or pierced by impermanence. Not everyone lies awake wondering whether their joy is merely distraction or whether their purpose is merely survival. Some are made for motion, for noise, for dreams that rise and fall with the tides of society. They are not wrong, but you are not wrong either. There is simply a difference in depth, and depth, by its nature, isolates. But in that isolation, something begins to awaken. At first, it feels like loss. The loss of innocence, the loss of belonging, the loss of ease. But with time, that loss becomes a kind of becoming. You begin to hear your own voice more clearly. You begin to ask questions not out of anxiety, but out of reverence. You begin to notice the small things, the curve of a leaf, the ache in a song, the way silence cradles truth better than any language can. And slowly, you realize that solitude is not a punishment. It is a mirror. It shows you who you are without the noise of the world, without comparison, without performance. It strips away the expectations you never agreed to carry. It removes the layers that kept you from yourself. And what remains is not just intelligence, but wisdom. Not just awareness, but intimacy. With life, with time, with your own fragile heart. You begin to understand that the pain of seeing too much is inseparable from the gift of seeing at all. That the sorrow of isolation is the soil where meaning grows. That the quiet you once feared is where life begins to speak most honestly. In solitude, you are no longer distracted from your own becoming. You are no longer diluted by the demands of fitting in. You are no longer split between the truth you feel and the mask you wear. But even here, the achy does not disappear. It changes shape. It becomes softer, but deeper. It stops asking for explanation and instead becomes a companion, a reminder that clarity comes at a cost, and that the cost is real. There are moments, long, aching moments, when you wish you could go back, when you envy those who can laugh without thought, dream without doubt, belong without effort. You long to return to that simplicity, but you know you cannot. Once you've tasted depth, surface can no longer sustain you, and so you learn to carry both, the burden of knowing and the grace of seeing. You learn to sit with your ache, not as a wound, but as a teacher. It teaches you to listen more than speak, to observe more than judge, to love without possession. It teaches you that some connections are rare, and that's what makes them sacred. That some moments are fleeting, and that's what makes them beautiful. It teaches you that not all truths need to be shared, and not all silences need to be filled. You begin to understand that life will not always meet you where you are. But that does not mean you are lost. It means you are walking ahead, carving a quieter path, a path that does not glitter, but glows, a path that will not always be seen, but will always be yours. And in time, that path brings with it a new kind of company. Not crowds, but kindred souls. People who have also walked through the fire of their own thoughts. People who know the taste of solitude, and yet do not fear it. People who can sit in silence with you, and not feel the need to break it. These souls are rare, but they are real. And when you find them, the loneliness fades. Not because you have finally fit in, but because you have finally been found. Until then, you learn to rest in your own presence, to find companionship in the sky, in the pages of old books, in the spaces between breaths. You learn that solitude does not mean abandonment. It means alignment. With your mind, with your soul, with the deeper currents of life that most have forgotten how to feel. And just when you think this solitude is all there is, something shifts. A moment arrives, not loud or grand, but tender. A moment that reminds you why you began this journey at all. A moment that carries you forward, not because everything is resolved, but because you have found something worth carrying. Something that speaks to the very core of you. It is in this quiet recognition that the next truth begins to bloom. The closing thought, the final insight, that perhaps the path of the solitary is not one of loss, but of return. A return to something sacred, a return to the self, a return to the kind of seeing that can hold the world exactly as it is, and still choose love. And so, the journey leads us here, to a quiet space where the mind rests not in conclusions, but in acceptance. After the storm of awareness, after the questions that unravel comfort, and the realizations that estrange us from the crowd, there is only stillness. Not the stillness of defeat, but of surrender. Not the surrender of weakness, but of wisdom. The sage, as Schopenhauer envisioned, is not one who claims to know everything. On the contrary, they are the one who has seen enough to know how little can truly be known. They do not shout their truths into the world. They carry them, like embers, quietly, warm, glowing, hidden in the hand. Their solitude is not the cold space of abandonment, but a sanctuary woven from inner peace, where the chaos of the world can be observed without being absorbed. The solitude of the sage is not loneliness. It is clarity, a place of watching rather than reacting, of feeling rather than fleeing. In this solitude, the sage sheds not only illusions, but also the compulsive need to be understood. They know that some truths cannot be shared, not because they are too complex, but because they are too simple, too honest, too unadorned. And in a world that favors noise, truth often arrives in a whisper, only to be dismissed. But the sage does not mourn this misunderstanding. They have seen that most people do not want truth. They want comfort. They want answers that reassure, not awaken. The sage, once like them, no longer demands that others wake up. They understand that each soul opens in its own time, and so they wait, they listen, they walk quietly among the world, not separate from it, but not tethered to it either. This is not a life without pain. In fact, it is because they have known pain so intimately that the sage no longer resists it. They have suffered through the illusion that life must always be pleasant, that love must always last, that understanding will always bring closeness. They have grieved what they once thought essential: belonging, admiration, certainty. But in that grieving, something new emerged, an inner stability that no longer depends on the shifting sands of external affirmation. The sage has become like the mountain, not immune to the wind, but unmoved by it. They have learned that to remain open is not the same as being vulnerable to destruction. It is, in fact, the only way to remain whole. Their solitude allows them to feel fully, without interruption, without needing to explain, without needing to be less. They no longer seek the next high, the next goal, the next validation. Their joy is quieter now, less like fireworks and more like the sunrise, slow, steady, unnoticed by most, but no less profound. They find it in the space between breaths, in the unfolding of a leaf, in the trembling silence after a profound thought. They have trained their eyes to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, not because the world has changed, but because they have. And so their solitude becomes a kind of communion, a communion with life not as we wish it to be, but as it is. With its imperfection, its impermanence, its indifference, this communion asks for no performance. It demands no masks. It welcomes the self as it is, fractured, beautiful, flawed, and whole. The sage understands that this kind of solitude cannot be given. It must be grown. It is cultivated through countless small choices. The choice to remain present when escape is easier. The choice to feel deeply when detachment would be safer. The choice to listen rather than speak, to observe rather than judge, to forgive rather than explain. It is the long discipline of staying with oneself, even when the world offers 1,000 ways to abandon that sacred responsibility. And in this discipline, something sacred is born: integrity. Not the kind that boasts of moral superiority, but the kind that quietly lives in alignment with truth. The sage no longer performs for applause, no longer shrinks for acceptance. They have found their rhythm, and it is no longer dictated by the world. They dance now to the music of the soul, a music heard only in stillness. But even as they dwell in this inner sanctum, they are not detached from humanity. In fact, their solitude has made them more human, more tender, more real. They carry no judgment for those who are still seeking, still striving, still stumbling in the dark. They remember that path intimately. They carry compassion not as a banner, but as a way of being, a softness in their gaze, a slowness in their words, a kindness that does not ask to be seen, because the sage knows everyone suffers. The loudest voices often mask the deepest pain. The brightest smiles often cover the most fragile hearts, and so they do not rush to correct, to advise, to rescue. They offer presence instead, a presence that says, "I see you. I do not need to fix you. You are enough even as you are becoming." Their solitude has made them full. So full, in fact, that they can give without emptying. They can love without losing. They can walk beside others without needing to be followed. This is the paradox of wisdom. The more one detaches from the need to be seen, the more clearly one begins to see. The less one clings, the more one receives. The less one speaks, the more one understands. This solitude is not an end. It is a beginning a beginning of a life lived inwardly rich, outwardly simple. It is not a retreat from the world, but a deeper re-entry, a way of being in the world that honors both its sorrow and its splendor. The sage does not seek to escape life, but to meet it fully, with open eyes, open hands, and an open heart. And from this sacred space, they watch the world spin, the cycles of desire and discontent, the endless striving and forgetting, and they feel no contempt, only compassion. They know that everyone, in their own way, is searching. Some run toward the light, others hide from it. Some fight their demons, others dance with them. Some will awaken, others will dream. But all are walking, somewhere. All are longing for something. The sage, in their solitude, holds that longing tenderly. They do not rush it. They do not push. They simply remain anchored, silent, awake. A lighthouse for those who are ready to see, not calling out, but shining. A presence that says, when you are ready, the way will be here. Not because I have made it, but because it has always been here. And perhaps, in that quiet radiance, others will begin to pause, to ask, to feel, to see. And in doing so, they too may step away from the noise, from the race, from the false promises of the world, and into themselves. This is the solitude of the sage, not a retreat from life, but a deeper embrace of it. A life lived not in opposition to the world, but in harmony with what is most true. And in that truth, there is peace, not the kind that shields you from suffering, but the kind that teaches you how to suffer with grace, how to love without fear, and how to walk alone without ever being truly alone.